Okay, everybody, let's take a look at your work from assignment 4.1. In this assignment, you were asked to create an image with a large depth of field and then an image with a small depth of field. So before we get into this review, just a little reminder of what we're looking for here. So a small depth of field, the foreground is going to be in focus and the background is going to be out of focus, or the foreground also could be out of focus. And then a large depth of field is going to be an image that has everything in focus. There's really three different factors that play into this. It's the f-stop or aperture setting, the distance you are away from the subject, and then the type of lens, either wide or telephoto. So large depth of field images, we're going to look for f-stops that are high, so 11 all the way up to 22. We're going to look for a large distance between the subject and the photographer, and we're going to look for wide angle lenses, or not telephoto lenses might be a more appropriate way of putting it. And then the opposite end of the scale for a small depth of field image, we're going to look for a lower aperture value. So ideally 5.6, 4.5, 2.8, 1.8. We are going to look for a small distance between the photographer and the subject. And then lastly, we will look for a telephoto lens rather than a wide angle lens. So with that being said, let's take a look at your work. And to start things out, we've got Katie's work. And Katie's got a large depth of field and then a small depth of field. Similar subject, the chair in the theater. Her first one here, she, in her reflection paper, told me that she used an aperture setting of 1.8, which would be very appropriate for a small depth of field. And we can see here the background is somewhat out of focus. Whoops, let's go the other way. You know, the stage props or stuff in the background is out of focus. And 1.8 is definitely a low aperture value, so definitely kudos to you on that. And certainly you're reasonably close to this, so I think all of it works here. And a pretty good example of a small depth of field image. And then you went ahead and essentially shot the same thing with a large depth of field. We can see, you know, again here, you know, the background is much more in focus. And in your reflections, you told me you shot this at an f-stop of 8, which is kind of like on the fence in terms of between large depth of field and small depth of field. So, you know, it's not ideal if your intention is to really create a large depth of field. I'd much rather see you shoot with a shutter set, an aperture or f-stop setting of 11, 16, or 22. And in that case, I think the stuff in the background here would be even that much more in focus. I mean, you know, it's definitely there. It's in a pretty good spot, but I think we could do an even better job with this with a higher aperture value or f-stop number. So I think you've got the idea here. Good examples. Not the best I've ever seen, but certainly I think you understand what we're looking for out of this assignment, and I think it just a couple of little tweaks here you can make to maybe come up with ideal images of what we're looking for here. So good job on this one. And next up we have Olivia's images. And we've got her small depth of field. Nice example of that. Flowers in focus. And the greenery in the background is clearly out of focus. We look at her file info, and we see that f-stop setting of 5.6, which is exactly what I'd expect to see in this instance. So nice job with this one, Olivia. I think good example of a small depth of field here. And then taking that very same image and turning it around into a large depth of field shot. I'm hoping that your f-stop is high. Yeah, it's really high. Actually, some cameras don't even go up to f-stop of 32. It looks like the T3 that you have does go up to f-stop of 32. And certainly in this instance, that works for me. I would say here, Olivia, this image does look a teeny bit on the dark side for me. And, we can go on camera raw, as you're probably learning about this week, and correct this. And there's lots of different ways to correct it. I'm just going to make a new adjustment layer and lighten it up like that. And we can see now that image looks just a little bit brighter. A little bit, I use the word poppier. And I think that complements the way this image is intended to be rendered. Because in this case, it kind of looks dark and muddy and, feels almost, not beautiful and bright and cheery as I imagine these would look in person. And, if we look at this first image, I think your exposure was really beautiful on this one. But the second one here, maybe we could have just brightened that up a teeny bit. And the way you do that, you could do it in post in Photoshop, but you could have done it out in the field too, just by changing this ISO from 100 to 200. And that would have just given us a little bit more brightness here. That would have, I think, given us a little richer color in the image. So good job with the technique, though. I think you've totally got the large and small depth of field down. So keep working hard, and look forward to seeing what you have for us in the next one. Okay. Next up we have Samantha's work. And sorry about that little pause there. I was just giving the image a nice once over here. And so I'm feeling like the background here in your small depth of field image is pretty much in focus here. And strangely enough, it seems like it's almost in better focus than what's going on in the foreground here. So we pull your reflections over. Actually, as you guys saw, I went in the file info here and was looking at your settings. Didn't really have any info there. It must have gotten stripped out. And then we go in and look at your reflections. And I see here you've got a shutter speed of 2. So I'm really not sure what that is. Are you telling us it was 2 seconds or a half of a second? Kind of confused there. And then the focal length of the lens, I'm sorry, I'm looking at the wrong one. So closer image, focal length of the lens I used was 28 millimeters, which for a small depth of field, we're actually looking for, it would have been a 200 millimeter image. And then your shutter speed, again, here you've got a shutter speed of 2. I'm not sure whether you're saying it's a half a second or 2 seconds. In either case, I think that it is problematic in that it's really slow, and probably is one of the reasons this image is as blurry as it is. If we go in here and look at it, we can see that image is pretty blurry there. So Samantha, I'm not necessarily convinced you've got a entirely developed understanding of what we're looking for here out of this image. Again, both the foreground and the background look like they're in focus, but here again the images are looking really blurry, and it almost looks like you resized them incorrectly too. 5 by no, that's correct. So they're blurry, and I suspect the blurriness is all about that shutter setting, whether that's half a second or 2 seconds. In either case, they are incorrect for this type of image. We would want, especially where they're running here, at least 1/125th of a second or 1/250th. Now, I wonder, perhaps you're confused with the aperture setting. Are you telling me the aperture is 2? In which case, that would be perfect for the small depth of field image here, but it would not be ideal for the large depth of field image. So maybe it's worth going back to the drawing board here, Samantha, and giving this another crack, especially maybe after you watch everybody's feedback here, and maybe that'll help explain what we're looking for a little bit more, and you'll see some good examples of where the foreground is very clearly in focus and that background is very clearly out of focus. And of course, if you're still feeling confused after you watch this whole thing, give a buzz or send a text, and I'd be happy to help you out with this in any way I can. So, again, watch everybody's and kind of review what we did in the module, and, hopefully that'll help. And if not, get in touch. And next up, we have Genesis's work. And so, again, Genesis, you embedded your images in a Word document. Hopefully, I had made it pretty clear to everyone in the last feedback that it's important that you don't put your stuff in Word documents. I want you to be working on the images themselves in Photoshop. So please, please, please remember that as we move forward into the upcoming modules here. So let's try and see if we can make sense of this from the little images here. So here's your large depth of field image. I'm presuming that's large depth of field. And we've got an f-stop of 22, which is ideal, a shutter setting of a 30th of a second, which is okay if you're holding held very steady. And if we zoom in here, sorry, just give me a second. So when we zoom in here, we look at this image, and the foreground, the background, everything looks like it's in focus here, which would make sense because you have an f-stop setting of 22. But then we go to the next image, which quite honestly, very pretty image. I love the sky that you've captured in here, and even the lens flare, which is kind of these little reflections of the sun hitting your lens, are all very pretty. But in this image we see the foreground, the middle ground, and the background again are all in focus, and we see we've got an f-stop of 22. So you gave me 2 images with large depth of fields. So both well executed images, but looking for one image where we've got the foreground in focus and the background out of focus. So a couple things to work on. You want to go in and check that out and see if you're comfortable creating that small depth of field. And then also I really want to reinforce the fact that I don't want the images in Word documents because we can't really look at them and look at all of our setting information in there. So please, as we move forward in the rest of the assignments, give them to me as separate JPEGs from your reflection paper. So thanks, and look forward to seeing your work next class. So next up we have Tori's work, and This is her large depth of field image. Let's see if we've got any file info. We do. And we've got an f-stop of 14, which is very appropriate for that. And you're kind of far back from the tree. And we can see how the tree's in focus and even all these little details in the background here. The fence and everything is in focus. Beautiful shot. And I love sort of the minimal aspect of this, where you've really kind of eliminated any other distractions from the photograph, and just our eye is pulled directly to the shape and form of the tree. I kind of wonder, you cut out the very tippy top of the tree here. Maybe we'd like to include that in the frame and just have a little bit of white around there so we get that really nice clean silhouette of the tree. But nonetheless, really good job with your large depth of field. And then here's your small depth of field shot. Let's look at the settings here first. In 5.6, that is absolutely correct. We've got a 55 millimeter lens, so that is it's going to work for me. And just the one thing here, there's not a lot to be out of focus. You haven't set this frame up in a way that we've got sort of a background and a foreground. I mean, the sun here is sort of blurring or flaring out. So I guess, we could say that's out of focus, but the sky's or the sun's probably going to do that in almost any case when it's kind of coming through a tree like this. So technically speaking, you did everything right here. You've got the right f-stop setting. You're using a normal or a slight telephoto lens on your camera, and you've gotten close to it. So all of those things work for me. The thing is, you just don't have sort of like a very distinct foreground and background. It's kind of like all middle ground, and maybe the real background here is just the sun. So it works, and it's a beautiful photo, by the way. I don't mean at all to diminish the value of the photo, because it is a very aesthetically pleasing photograph. But just, in terms of technique-wise, probably not the ideal subject matter for this technique. But nevertheless, I get that you understand what we're doing here, and relatively speaking, all of your settings are where they need to be. So good job on that. And next up, we have Elise's images and her small depth of field shot. Don't see any info in there. So we go to the reflection paper here for the magic numbers, and looks like we have an f-stop of 4 at 1/25th of a second. And so we'll go back to this one, and we see how these teacups in the background go out of focus. You're really close to this teacup here, so this is going to be another factor in here that is going to go to, again, exaggerate that depth of field. Remember, there's those three factors: the distance away from the subject, the f-stop, and then the kind of lens here. So you pretty much have all three of those factors working in your favor, with being close, having a small telephoto, and using an f-stop of 4, which all, again, have our eye just land right on this part of the photograph. And this is sort of really where the interesting things are, the sort of fluted edges of the cup, and even the interesting painting or graphics that are on it. And then our large depth of field image, you didn't in your reflections note what the f-stop was on this, but I think we can all see how this image has got all the cups in it are in very clear focus, and we can see it's a nice visual line that our eye kind of works through here, and there's a certain repetition of pattern that's also pleasing that works here. If there was a big some sort of food or something, a big spoon or something like that in this cup, it might maybe take this image one step further. But as you noted in your reflections, I think this is probably the most successful of the two images, and certainly that's the one with the small depth of field, which I think you've done beautifully here. So good job on this one, Elise. And next up we have Kate's work, and we've got her small depth of field and her large depth of field. So I think this is a classic example of how we can take depth of field and using essentially the same exact subject matter, come up with two images that look very, very different. Kate, you've done a wonderful job on this. I think this gives us all a good example of what I'm looking for out of this assignment here. We've got an f-stop setting of 2.7. We can see that our eye is really drawn to the sort of the textural element and the pattern of the metal area of the fence. The background is really soft and out of focus, so our eye really isn't attracted to that. And then in contrast, when we go to the large depth of field, the fence is in focus, the road is in focus, and I'm sure if we went to our file info, we would see a higher f-stop number. Again, I'm wondering if your camera only goes up to an f-stop of 8, so that might be the maximum f-stop that it has. But in any case, much higher f-stop than the f of 2. And also you've kind of backed away. You're a little bit farther away from the subject. So again, you've got a couple factors working for you here to help establish that large depth of field. So great job with this, Kate. Really good examples of what we're looking for in this assignment. So keep up the good work. And next up we have Sammy's work. So we can see the small depth of field here and large depth of field. And first glance, everything looks as it should be. And we look at our file info. I guess our camera again's kind of stripping that data out of there. But we can see the flower here very, very clearly in focus, and the background, City Hall and all the lights of downtown are out of focus here. So really nice job with this portion of the assignment. And we can just pull in your reflections here, and I see that you wrote your f-stop of 4.5, which is very, very appropriate. And then your large depth of field image, you've got an f-stop of 25, which again, that very high f-stop on this image here. And we can see how just by changing that f-stop, doesn't look like you've changed anything else here. Just by working with that f-stop, you've gotten everything in focus in this image here. So again, super job with this. And by the way, nice job on being a little creative with this, trying to find some interesting subjects and taking a different vantage point. So, we tend to see the world from eye level all the time. Nobody really sees the world from, I presume this is like a bench, from the spot that our butt touches the bench. So it's a different vantage point that you're giving us. It's a unique vantage point. And you have so many cool things going on that we'll even talk about in the next module here, from the lines that are pulling our eye into the photograph, to the repeating patterns of the arm rails, to even the repeating shapes that are broken up by the flower of these sort of wooden slats or whatever these are that support the bench in here. So great job with this, Sammy. Another really, really solid example of what I am looking for out of this assignment. And next up we have Maddie's images, and we've got the small depth of field and the large depth of field here. And look at our file info, and we've got an f-stop of 22 on the large depth of field. We can see the spokes are in focus, we can see the ready share in focus, and we can even see everything down the street here in focus. So great job on this. And again, just like I said to Sammy, you're taking a vantage point that's not common. You've gotten down low to the ground, It's a spot that we're not used to seeing the world from, so it provides the viewer with sort of an interesting perspective, one that's not common. And so I think from that point of view, you're creating an image that is immediately going to be attractive to the viewers because you're giving them a fresh eye, a fresh way of looking at things. And then your small depth of field image, go into your file info, and of course f-stop of 4.0, perfect. And we can see the tire, especially the writing on the tire, is in focus, and the ready share sign and everything else in the background is out of focus. So great job. Totally nailed the technique here, and just like Sammy, I think you're providing us with some very creative imagery, which I know for all of you guys, these first few assignments are very technical oriented, and it's pretty easy to go out and just pick any old subject and shoot it. And so I certainly appreciate when you guys go out and try to be a little bit more innovative with your image taking, and we can really see when people have taken the time to try to create images that are new, fresh, and different. So good job on this, Maddie, and look forward to seeing what you got for us in the next one. And then we'll wrap up this week's feedback with Bailey's images. And again, we see really good examples of small and large depth of field here. So in this image, our eye very clearly goes to this fence post that has got this wonderful textural characteristic, as well as some of this really neat moss that's growing in there. So let's look at our file info. F-stop of 5.6, perfect, exactly what I'd want to see. And we can really see how this background, that very soft, creamy background, allows our eye to go to the thing that's in very sharp, clear focus, which again is that fence post there. So super job on this one. And then we've got the large depth of field image. Let's take a look at your file info. So here on your file info, you've got an f-stop of 4. So this is not ideal for a large depth of field. The image works as a large depth of field image because you've backed away from the subject. So again, to reinforce, backing away from a subject, or extending the distance between the subject and the photographer, is going to give us a large depth of field. And also having a wide angle lens, which let's look at those file info settings again. And you're at 28 millimeters, which is a wide angle lens. So 2 of the 3 things that we're looking for to create a large depth of field you've got there, but you're missing sort of the big component, which is this f-stop setting, which we'd love to see that 11, 16, 22. And if that was the case, then I think we would see this fence post in the foreground would also be in sharp focus. So how would we do that? It's pretty simple here. We take this ISO that's at 100 and we move it up to 800. So think about it. From 100 to 200, that's doubled once. 200 to 400, that's doubled a second time. 400 to 800, that's doubled 3 times. So then we can just double the f-stop number 3 times. So we go 4 to 5.6, 5.6 to 8, and then 8 to 11. And that would give us the same exact exposure, but you would have a lot better large depth of field. So this would be in much better focus. So, I think you've got it 3/4 of the way here, but still one little piece of the puzzle that we'd like to see you execute a little bit better here. So that is going to do it for everybody for this feedback. As I always say on all of these, if you have any questions, any points that you aren't 100% clear on, or if you just also like to respond to some of the feedback, please feel free to shoot me an email or give me a call or whatever you're comfortable with, and we can chat about it in more detail and hopefully eliminate any confusion you may have going along. And as I mentioned, we're going to start to move past these very technical assignments and try to begin to become a little bit more creative and aesthetically pleasing in our images. So keep that in the back of your mind as we push forward. So looking forward to seeing everybody's work in our next assignment.